The first body we recovered was Dale Purcell, and I was wrong about him from the beginning. I want to be clear about that, because the instinct, when you tell a story like this, is to build toward the moment you figured it out, to make yourself the person who saw what others missed. I didn't. I was the person who missed it longest. I missed it because I had 17 years of fieldwork telling me I understood what that landscape could do to a person, and I trusted that knowledge more than I trusted the people standing in front of me telling me I was wrong. 3 hunters disappeared near Maine Marsh between October 2nd and November 11th. 2 of them are dead. 1 of them I carried out myself. The 3rd is alive because of Lucy Pelletier, not because of me. And if I'd listened to her 6 days earlier, Raymond Pelletier might still have both his legs. I'm telling you what happened. Not because I understand it. I do now too late and too completely, but because the person who should be telling this story doesn't want to, and she's earned the right to that silence. And the least I can do is make sure the record exists without asking her to be the one holding it. Part 1. What I thought I knew. Maine Marsh sits 11 miles northeast of Street Oralee, in the unorganized territory where Aroostook County stops pretending to be populated and just becomes woods. It's not on most maps. The USGS quads show it. The Maine Atlas shows it as a blue smear on page 68. If you've hunted that region, you might know it by the name the old Acadian families use, Les Marais Creux, the hollow marsh, which tells you everything about its topography and nothing about why you should stay away from it. I need to describe it accurately because the shape of the place is part of why I was wrong. Maine Marsh is not a simple wetland. It's a peatland complex, a raised bog system surrounded by a lag zone of deeper water, fringed by black spruce and tamarack, sitting in a depression between 2 low ridgelines that run roughly north-south. The bog surface itself is maybe 300 acres. The lag, the moat of saturated ground between the raised center and the mineral soil of the surrounding forest, is another 100, and that's where the danger is, or where I believed the danger was. Lag zones in northern peatlands are deceptive. The surface looks solid sphagnum, sedge, sometimes a skin of ice in October that seems like it should hold weight. It doesn't. Underneath is 4 to 12 feet of semi-liquid peat, cold water, and root mass that will grab a boot and not let go. I have personally extracted 2 moose from lag zones in my career. 1 was alive. The other had been dead for about a week, and we found it because a pilot saw the antlers sticking up out of what looked like solid ground. If you fall through, the water is between 38 and 45 degrees depending on the season. Hypothermia starts in minutes. The peat compresses around your legs and creates suction. If you're wearing waders and hunters in marsh-adjacent territory, often are they fill and become anchors. You can't pull yourself out, because everything you grab is also floating on the same substrate. You go down to your waist, your chest, and then you're done. The more you struggle, the faster it goes. This is what I told the families. This is what I told the search coordinators. This is what I put in my initial incident reports. I said, the terrain is the threat. Maine Marsh has unstable lag margins, poor GPS coverage due to the ridgeline interference, and limited access. The most probable cause of these disappearances is environmental. And I was confident. I was confident because I'd seen it before, not at Maine specifically, but at a dozen other bogs across the northern district. I'd helped recover a snowmobiler from a peatland near Allagash in 2019. I'd written the safety advisory that went out to hunting camps in the region every September. I knew what peatlands did to people, and when the first hunter didn't come back, my mind closed around that explanation like a fist, and didn't open again for almost 3 weeks. Dale Purcell was 57, from Presque Isle, and had been hunting the Theriot area for at least 20 seasons. He wasn't careless. He wasn't inexperienced. He'd filed a hunt plan with his wife, carried a PLB, a personal locator beacon, and told her he'd be back by dark on October 2nd. He didn't come back. His wife called the Aroostook County Sheriff's Office at 9:40 p.m. They contacted our district office. I was the responding officer. by 6 a.m. On October 3rd, I was at the trailhead where Purcell had parked his truck, a gated logging road about 2 miles south of the marsh. His truck was there. His gear bag was in the cab, organized the way experienced hunters organize. Nothing missing that shouldn't be missing. Nothing present that didn't belong. I found his boot prints on the road, heading north. The ground was soft. It had rained on October 1st, and I could track him easily for about a mile before the canopy thickened and the surface went to duff and root. I brought in 2 other officers and a dog team from the warden service. We searched for 3 days. The dog picked up scent heading northeast toward the marsh, lost it at the edge of the lag zone, and never recovered it. We walked the perimeter. We used a drone with thermal. We found nothing. On October 5th, I filed my report. Probable environmental cause: peatland immersion. Body likely unrecoverable without significant drawdown of the lag zone, which is not recommended due to ecological sensitivity. His wife, Teresa Purcell, sat across from me in the district office and asked me if I was sure. I said I was. I wasn't lying. I believed it. But believing something isn't the same as being sure. And I'd blurred that line so smoothly, I didn't even feel it happen. The second disappearance was Gary Colford, 41, from Mars Hill, November 1st. Same general area he'd been hunting with a partner, separated mid-morning, and didn't show up at the rendezvous point by 2 p.m. His partner, Kevin Theriot, no relation to the marsh. Different spelling. This is Aroostook County. The names recycle. Called it in at 4:15. Same search. Same result. Dog picked up the trail heading toward the marsh. Lost it in the same general area. No beacon activation. Colford hadn't been carrying one. No cell signal that deep. No body. I filed the same report with the same conclusion. I recommended the department issue a formal advisory against hunting within a half-mile of Theriot Marsh due to hazardous terrain. The advisory went out on November 3rd. Kevin Theriot came to see me at the district office. He sat in the same chair Teresa Purcell had sat in. He was a big man, logger's build, and he was trying not to cry. Gary wouldn't have gone into that marsh, he said. People misjudge the margins, I said. The lag zone extends further than it looks, especially after rain. The surface vegetation. I know what a bog looks like. I've lived here my whole life. Gary knew what a bog looked like. He wouldn't have walked into it. It may not have been a matter of walking into it. A game trail along the margin. Soft ground. One wrong step. Then where's his rifle? Where's his pack? If he fell in right at the edge, we'd see something. You'd see drag marks, or his gear where he dropped it. You didn't find anything. He was right. We hadn't. I'd accounted for that in my own thinking by reasoning that the suction effect could pull a loaded pack down with the body and that a rifle slung on a shoulder would go with the person. It was plausible. It was even probable, given the right conditions. But Kevin Theriot wasn't arguing probability. He was arguing character. He was telling me he knew Gary Colford, knew what Gary would and wouldn't do, and I was telling him that the landscape didn't care what Gary would and wouldn't do. I was right about the landscape. I was wrong about what it meant. Part 2. Lucy. Lucy Pelletier showed up at the district office on November 5th, without an appointment. I was doing paperwork. The Colford search had generated a significant documentation load, and I was also fielding calls from a Bangor Daily News reporter who'd connected the 2 disappearances and wanted a statement. Lucy was maybe 35, small, dark-haired, with the kind of face that doesn't waste movement. She was wearing a canvas work jacket and boots that had seen actual mud, not the kind you buy to look like you've seen mud. She asked for me by name. I'm Lucy Pelletier. My uncle is Raymond Pelletier. He traps the drainage east of Theriot Marsh. Has for 40 years. Lucy. I knew the name. Raymond Pelletier held one of the last active trapping permits in the district. I'd checked his lines once. Years ago, everything legal. Well maintained. A man who knew what he was doing. What can I do for you? My uncle hasn't come out in 9 days. This didn't immediately alarm me the way it should have. Trappers in the North Woods, especially old-timers like Raymond, sometimes stayed out for extended periods. They had cabins, caches, and a relationship with the calendar that didn't match ours. 9 days wasn't unusual. Does he have a check-in schedule with anyone? With me, every Sunday. He uses a satellite messenger. He sent his last check-in on October 26th. Nothing since. That was different. That was a break in pattern for a man who apparently maintained one. The message on the 26th? Anything unusual? No. Just okay. That's what he always sends. Just okay. And you're concerned because of the other disappearances. She looked at me steadily. I'm concerned because my uncle knows that marsh better than anyone alive, and he told me in September that something was wrong with it. One. Wrong how? He said the moose were avoiding it. He said the deer trails that used to run along the eastern margin had shifted a quarter-mile east. He said the birds were wrong. Wrong how? He didn't say how. He said wrong. He said the marsh was active, and I should keep my kids away from the eastern road. I wrote this down. I want to be honest. I wrote it down the way you write down something you're going to file and not think about again. Animal behavior shifts have a dozen explanations. Weather patterns, forage changes, predator movements, disease. A trapper saying the birds were wrong and the marsh was active sounded like a man in his 70s, interpreting normal ecological variation through the lens of a lifetime of pattern recognition that had started to drift toward superstition. I didn't say that to Lucy. I said I'd open a welfare check and send someone out to Raymond's cabin. I don't want you to send someone, she said. I want to go with you. I know where his lines are. I know which cabin he'd be at this time of year. Ma'am, I appreciate that, but 2 hunters are missing. My uncle is missing. All 3 near the same marsh. And you're going to send one officer alone? She wasn't asking. She was telling me what I already knew and was trying not to act on, because acting on it meant admitting the situation was more than what I'd said it was in 2 official reports. I'll go myself, I said. Tomorrow. You can come, but you follow my lead, and you stay where I tell you to stay. Fine. She stood up. At the door, she turned back. Officer Bouchard. My uncle doesn't spook. He's not a man who says something is wrong unless something is wrong. I need you to hear that. And I hear you. I heard her. I didn't listen. There's a difference. And by November 5th, the difference was already costing lives. Part 3. What the marsh looked like. We went in on November 6th. I drove to the gated road, Lucy behind me, in her own truck. It was 28 degrees at dawn, the sky the color of old tin, and the tamarack had dropped their needles so the understory had that open. Skeletal look that northern swamps get in November, when everything deciduous has given up, but the snow hasn't committed yet. I need to describe what we found, and I need to do it without shaping the description toward the conclusion I eventually reached, because that would be dishonest. I'll tell you what I saw and what I thought at the time, and then I'll tell you what it actually meant. We hiked in on the logging road for a mile, then cut northeast on a trapper's trail that Lucy knew. The trail was well used. Raymond's boot prints were visible in places, overlapping themselves from repeated trips, and there were older tracks underneath from previous seasons, compressed into a permanent, shallow trench in the duff. The forest here was mixed spruce, fir, some birch on the higher ground, and the light was that flat, gray November light that doesn't cast shadows but makes everything look slightly closer than it is. After about 40 minutes, the ground started to soften. The spruce closed in and got shorter, a sign of poor drainage and acidic soil, the transition zone between mineral ground and peatland. I could smell the marsh before I could see it, that cold, tannin-heavy, slightly sulfurous smell that peatlands have, like the earth is composting itself in slow motion. Raymond's cabin was on a slight rise, about 200 yards east of the lag zone margin. It was a trapper's cabin, in the old style, small, tight, built from peeled logs, with a corrugated metal roof, a wood stove chimney, 1 window, 1 door, well maintained. The door was closed, but not locked. There was no lock, just a latch. Inside, his gear: trapping supplies, food stores, a sleeping bag on a plank bunk, a kerosene lantern, books, 2 Louis L'Amour paperbacks, and a Bible in French. His satellite messenger was on the table next to a tin cup. The stove was cold. There was no sign of disturbance, no sign of struggle, no sign of anything except a man who had walked out one morning and not come back. Lucy stood in the doorway and looked at everything and said nothing for a long time. "His boots are gone," she said finally. "His rifle's gone. His pack is gone. He went out working." That's consistent with what we've seen in the other cases. The men leave their base, head toward the marsh. He wouldn't go to the marsh. He traps east. His lines run east along the drainage. The marsh is west. He has no reason to go west. Maybe he saw something. A moose. I just told you the moose don't go near the marsh anymore. I stopped. She was looking at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. Not anger, not contempt, but a kind of focused patience, like she was waiting for something heavy to finish falling. "Let me check his lines," she said. "Lucy, his lines run east, away from the marsh. Let me check them. If he went out working, that's where he went. If something happened to him on his trap line, we'll find sign there. If we don't find sign, then we talk about the marsh." It was logical. It was, in fact, exactly what I should have proposed myself. But I hadn't, because my mental model had already committed to the marsh as the explanation, and her suggestion required me to entertain the possibility that I'd been wrong not once, not twice, but 3 times. "Okay," I said. "We check the lines. Together. You lead." We followed Raymond's trap line east for about 1.5 miles. Lucy moved through the woods the way her uncle must have taught her, reading the ground, stopping at each set, checking the placement, the condition of the hardware, the bait. Everything was undisturbed. The sets were intact. Some had been triggered by animals and not reset, which told us Raymond hadn't checked them recently, but there was no sign of injury, no blood, no equipment dropped in haste. At the end of the line, the trail curved south and climbed a low ridge. Lucy stopped at the top and looked west. From here, you could see the marsh, the open expanse of the raised bog, the dark ring of spruce around the lag zone, the whole thing sitting in its depression like a lens of dead ground. "There," Lucy said, pointing. I looked. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I did. On the eastern margin of the marsh, maybe 300 yards from where we stood, there was a structure, not a cabin, smaller, lower, partially screened by the spruce fringe. It looked like a hunting blind, but larger, a lean-to, maybe, or a makeshift shelter. "That's not my uncle's," Lucy said. "He doesn't build on the marsh side." I raised my binoculars. The structure was made of cut poles and tarps, blue poly tarps, the kind you buy at any hardware store. It was roughly 8 by 12 feet, open on one side, facing the marsh. There was no smoke, no movement. "Could be a hunter's camp," I said. "Someone set up for the season." "On the lag margin?" "You just told me the ground there is unstable." She was right. Nobody with any experience would set up a camp on the lag margin. The ground was too wet, too unpredictable. "I want to go look at it," I said. "So do I." We descended the ridge and worked our way south and then west toward the structure. The ground got wetter as we approached. My boots were sinking 2 inches with every step, and I could feel the substrate flexing underneath, that unsettling elastic quality that peatland margins have, like walking on the skin of something breathing. The structure was empty, but it hadn't been empty long. Inside, a sleeping bag, damp but not soaked, a camp stove with a half-used fuel canister, 2 MREs, one opened and eaten, one untouched, a pair of heavy rubber boots, size 11 or 12, a coil of rope, not paracord, not the lightweight stuff hikers carry, but heavy 3/4-inch braided nylon, the kind you'd use for towing or hauling, about 100 feet of it. And in the corner, under the sleeping bag, a handheld VHF radio. No personal identification, no wallet, no phone, no vehicle registration, no name written on anything. I picked up the radio and turned it on. It was tuned to a frequency I didn't recognize. Not a standard emergency channel, not a marine band, not one of the commercial frequencies used by logging operations in the area. Officer Bouchard. I turned. Lucy had walked around the outside of the structure and was standing at the back, looking at the ground. Come see this. Behind the structure, running from the back wall toward the marsh, there were drag marks. 2 parallel furrows in the soft ground, about 18 inches apart, consistent with something heavy being pulled on its back. The furrows ran straight for about 30 feet, and then curved north along the lag margin and disappeared into the spruce fringe. I've seen drag marks before. I've seen them from moose carcasses hauled out of the bush. I've seen them from canoes pulled over portages. I've seen them from injured animals dragging themselves. These were from a person. The width, the depth, the way the heels had cut in at intervals where the body's weight had shifted, it was a person being dragged. Lucy was looking at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I got on my radio and called the district office. I requested immediate search and rescue deployment to Maine Marsh, all available personnel. I requested law enforcement support from the Aroostook County Sheriff's Office. I requested a K-9 team. Then I looked at Lucy Pelletier and said the thing I should have said 6 days earlier. I think you're right. I don't think the marsh killed those men. Part 4. What we found when we followed the drag marks. I need to be precise here, because what happened over the next 4 hours is the subject of an ongoing criminal investigation. And I've been told by the district attorney's office what I can and can't discuss publicly. I'll stay within those boundaries, but I'm going to tell you everything I'm allowed to tell you. Lucy and I followed the drag marks north along the lag margin. I told her to stay behind me. She didn't argue, but she also didn't fall back more than 10 feet, and she had a hand on the knife on her belt the entire time. The drag marks ran for approximately a 1/4 mile along the margin, staying on the narrow strip of semi-solid ground between the spruce fringe and the beginning of the lag's saturated zone. Whoever had made them knew the ground they'd followed the one viable path through terrain that would swallow you on either side if you stepped 3 feet in the wrong direction. The marks ended at a second structure. This one was better built, older, more permanent, dug partially into a rise of mineral soil that jutted into the bog like a peninsula. It had a framed door, a plywood floor, and a roof of layered tarps and cut boughs. It was invisible from more than 50 yards away. I announced myself. No response. I drew my sidearm wildlife officers in Maine, carry firearms, and approached the door. The smell hit me before I opened it. Not decomposition. Not exactly. Something medical. Antiseptic. Chemical. Wrong for the woods. Later I learned it was a combination of veterinary ketamine and rubbing alcohol. But in the moment, all I knew was that it smelled like a place where something clinical had been done, in a place where nothing clinical should ever happen. Inside, on a pallet of spruce boughs and a foam sleeping pad, was Raymond Pelletier. He was alive. He was unconscious. His left leg below the knee was wrapped in a mass of duct tape and what looked like torn cotton, a shirt, maybe. And the wrapping was soaked through with old blood, brown and stiff at the edges, red and wet at the center. His right leg was zip-tied at the ankle to a ground stake driven through the plywood floor. His hands were zip-tied in front of him. His face was gray. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and irregular, and his skin, when I touched his forehead, was hot. Lucy came through the door behind me. I heard her make a sound, not a scream, not a gasp, something lower than either, a sound from the bottom of the chest, and then she was on her knees beside him, her hands on his face, saying his name. Raymond, Raymond, mon oncle, c'est Lucy, je suis là. His eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, but they tracked to her face. "Le Marais," he said. "Il utilise le Marais." He uses the marsh. Not the marsh is dangerous. Not I fell in. He uses the marsh. I cut the zip ties with my knife. Lucy was already assessing his leg. She told me later she'd done 2 years of nursing school before dropping out for financial reasons, and in that moment, it showed. She unwrapped the duct tape carefully, and I watched her face change as the wound was revealed, and I looked, and I understood why it changed. The injury to Raymond's left leg was not from a fall, not from a trap, not from an animal. It was a compound fracture of the tibia, and the bone was set badly, but deliberately. Someone had set the bone and wrapped it. Someone had given him ketamine. We found the vials later to keep him sedated. Someone had kept him alive, kept him contained, and kept him hidden in a structure built for exactly this purpose. And the drag marks behind the first structure told me that Raymond wasn't the first person who had been dragged along that path. Here is what I need to tell you, and what I should have understood weeks earlier. The marsh didn't kill Dale Purcell and Gary Colford. A man killed them. A man who understood the marsh well enough to use it. Its reputation, its terrain, its remoteness, and the assumptions that people like me would make about what it was capable of. His name was Darren Mosley. He was 44 years old, from Holton, and he had a record assault, criminal threatening, a dismissed charge of unlawful restraint from 2017. He'd been living in the woods near Maine Marsh since at least August. We don't know exactly when he arrived. We don't know everything about why he did what he did, and I'm not going to speculate on his psychology because that's not my field and the court process is still ongoing. What I can tell you is what the evidence showed. Mosley had built the structures on the lag margin. He'd learned the terrain, the paths through the bog, the spots where the ground held and where it didn't. He'd positioned himself in an area where cell coverage didn't exist, GPS was unreliable, and the nearest human habitation was 11 miles away. He'd stocked supplies for an extended stay. He had the rope, the zip ties, the veterinary ketamine sourced, we later learned, from a farm supply theft in Caribou that hadn't been connected to anything. He'd intercepted hunters in the woods near the marsh. Dale Purcell first, then Gary Colford. The evidence suggests he approached them as a fellow hunter, a reasonable encounter in the woods, nothing immediately alarming. What happened next, in both cases, involved the rope, the ketamine, and eventually, the marsh itself. We found Dale Purcell's body in the lag zone, in 4 feet of peat water, weighted with rocks in his pockets. Mosley hadn't just let the bog take him, he'd put him there. He'd used the marsh as a disposal site, knowing correctly that an investigating officer would look at a body in a peatland and see an accident. Gary Colford's body was found later, deeper in the lag, in a spot accessible only by a route Mosley had marked with cut branches. Same method. Rocks. Zip tie marks on the wrists, visible despite the tannin staining of the water. Raymond Pelletier had been alive because Mosley had apparently decided to keep him. We don't know why. Raymond has not spoken about what happened during the 9 days he was held. Lucy says he may never speak about it, and she's asked me not to ask him, and I don't intend to. What I know is that when Lucy and I found Raymond, Mosley was not at the site. He'd been gone for at least several hours. The drag marks we'd followed had been made earlier, probably Raymond being moved from one structure to the other, and Mosley's boot prints, which we identified later, led away from the area heading north. I radioed our position and Raymond's condition. SAR reached us in 3 hours with a litter team. Lucy stayed with her uncle the entire time, managing his temperature, keeping him talking when he was conscious, doing the things I should have been trained to do but that she did on instinct and love. Raymond was airlifted from a clearing a mile east of the marsh. He was in surgery that night. He lost the leg below the knee. The fracture had been improperly set for too long. Infection had moved into the bone, and the surgeons in Presque Isle told Lucy there was no saving it. Darren Mosley was apprehended on November 8th 2 days later, by a combined team from the Warden Service and State Police, approximately 6 miles north of the marsh, heading toward the Canadian border. He was carrying a pack with supplies for several days, and he had Gary Colford's hunting rifle. He did not resist arrest. He did not make a statement. Part 5. What I carry. I've been a wildlife officer for 17 years. I've worked poaching cases. I've done search and rescue. I've pulled people out of rivers and off cliffs. And once, out of the jaws of a situation with a bull moose that I still don't fully understand. I've always believed that the thing that made me good at my job was my knowledge of the land, the way I could read terrain, predict animal behavior, understand the systems that people enter when they walk into the woods. That knowledge is real. I'm not discounting it, but I am telling you what it cost when I let it replace listening. Lucy Pelletier told me on November 5th that her uncle said the marsh was active and the animals were avoiding it. I interpreted that as ecological. It was behavioral. The animals were avoiding the marsh because a human predator had established territory there, and they'd adjusted their patterns the way prey animals always do when a new apex threat enters an area. The moose moved their trails. The birds changed their patterns. Raymond saw it because he'd been watching that landscape for 40 years, and he knew what it looked like without a predator in it. He tried to investigate. He went to the marsh, something he'd told Lucy he never did, because he understood that the change he was observing required a cause, and the cause was at the marsh. And Mosley found him, or was waiting for him, or both. Kevin Theriot told me on November 3rd that Gary Colford wouldn't have walked into the marsh. I interpreted that as a grieving man refusing to accept an accidental death. It was a man who knew his friend telling me, accurately, that the scenario I'd constructed was inconsistent with everything true about the person inside it. I didn't listen to Kevin either. I listened to the landscape. I listened to my own expertise. I let my model of the environment overwrite the testimony of people who knew things I didn't. Not technical things, not scientific things, but human things. Who a person was. What they would and wouldn't do. Where they would and wouldn't go. Dale Purcell hunted that area for 20 seasons. He knew the lag zone. He wouldn't have walked into it. His wife knew that. I should have weighted her knowledge equal to mine. I didn't, because hers was personal and mine was professional, and I'd built a career on the assumption that professional knowledge was the more reliable kind. It's not. It's the more generalizable kind. But when you're trying to understand what happened to a specific person in a specific place, the people who knew that person are carrying information you will never have. And if you dismiss it because it doesn't fit your model, you are choosing your comfort over their truth. I went to see Teresa Purcell after the arrests. I sat in her kitchen in Presque Isle and told her what had happened to her husband. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You thought it was the bog," she said. "Yes. I told you Dale knew that bog." "You did. What would have happened if you'd looked for a person instead of an accident?" I've thought about this question every day. The honest answer is, I don't know. Mosley was already established at the marsh by the time Dale disappeared. Even if I'd suspected foul play immediately, the search area was vast, and Mosley's structures were well concealed. We might not have found him in time to save Gary Colford, but we might have. If I'd treated Dale's disappearance as a potential crime scene instead of a terrain accident, we'd have brought in different resources, forensic tracking, a more systematic grid search, possibly aerial surveillance that would have spotted the structures. We'd have been looking for signs of human activity rather than signs of environmental hazard. We'd have been asking different questions. I told Teresa Purcell the truth. It might have saved Gary. I don't know. But I should have been looking. She nodded. She didn't forgive me. She didn't condemn me. She poured me a cup of coffee and asked about Raymond, and I told her he was recovering, and she said she'd bring a casserole to the Pelletiers, and I left her house carrying the weight of an ordinary kindness I hadn't earned. Part 6. Lucy Pelletier's version. Lucy came to the district office one more time, in late November, after Raymond was home. She'd driven him back from the rehabilitation center in Bangor, a 5-hour drive, and she stopped in on her way north. She looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, the kind of tired that comes from holding someone else's recovery together, while processing your own damage in whatever margins of time are left over. "How is he?" I asked. "Adapting. He wants to go back to his cabin in the spring." "Can he?" "Probably not, but he wants to, and I'm not going to tell him he can't. I'll figure out how to make it work." She sat down. She looked at me for a while. "You're going to write a report," she said. "I've written several. You're going to write the real one, the one where you explain what happened and what went wrong, for the department." "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Okay." "If my uncle had been a different kind of person, if he'd been a professor or a biologist, or someone with letters after his name, and he'd told you the Marsh was acting wrong, would you have listened sooner?" I sat with that. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say that my failure was about terrain bias, not about who was speaking. But Lucy Pelletier had asked me to be honest, and she'd earned honesty the way you earn it, by being right when it was inconvenient for everyone around her. "Maybe," I said. "I think I would have taken the observation more seriously. I might have gone out sooner. I might have framed it differently in my own head. Because a trapper saying the birds are wrong sounds like folklore, and a biologist saying the birds are wrong sounds like data." "Yes, but it was the same information." "Yes." She nodded. She stood up. "I don't think you're a bad officer," she said. "I think you're a man who trusted the wrong thing. You trusted what you knew about the ground, and you forgot that the ground doesn't tell you everything. People tell you the rest, and you have to let them." "Let." She shook my hand. She left. I haven't seen her since, though I've heard from Kevin Theriot, who, it turns out, knows the Pelletier family through the kind of 3 degrees of connection that defines Aroostook County, that Raymond is doing okay, that he's walking with a prosthetic, that he hasn't gone back to the cabin. Part 7. What the Marsh is now. Theriot Marsh is a crime scene, which means it's wrapped in tape and procedure, which means, for the first time in its existence, it's being looked at by people who aren't trappers or hunters or wildlife officers, forensic teams, state police investigators, prosecutors building a case. They found Dale Purcell. They found Gary Colford. They cataloged Mosley's structures, his supplies, his routes through the bog. They mapped the paths he'd cut through the spruce fringe, the way he'd learned to move through the lag zone using submerged root systems as stepping stones, a technique, I'll note, that I'd never seen anyone use, and that represented a genuinely sophisticated understanding of peatland hydrology. The marsh itself is unchanged. It doesn't care about what happened in and around it. It will continue to be a 300-acre raised bog with dangerous margins, unreliable footing, and a tendency to swallow things that step in the wrong place. It was never the threat. It was the setting for one, and I confused the two because the setting was something I understood, and the threat was something I'd failed to imagine. I drive past the access road now on my patrols. I don't stop. There's nothing there for me to do. The investigation is in other hands, the case is in the courts, and the marsh is being the marsh, indifferent and permanent. But I think about Lucy. I think about what she said, that the ground doesn't tell you everything, and people tell you the rest. I've started writing it down and keeping it where I can see it. Not because I think a note on my desk will prevent the next failure of imagination, but because the act of writing it reminds me, every morning, that the thing I was most confident about was the thing I was most wrong about, and the people I dismissed were the people carrying the truth. If you hunt in northern Maine, be careful. Not because of the marshes, though the marshes are genuinely dangerous. Be careful, because the woods are big and empty, and the things that happen in them don't always have the explanations you expect. And if someone who knows the land tells you something is wrong, a trapper, a guide, a person who has watched the same piece of ground for decades and is telling you it's changed, listen to them. Don't filter what they're saying through what you think you know. Don't translate their language into yours and then discard what doesn't survive the translation. Listen, that's the thing I didn't do. That's the thing that cost Dale Purcell and Gary Colford their lives, and Raymond Pelletier his leg. The marsh was never the story. The people were. They always are.